Welcome to BeProvided Conservation Radio, sharing stories and information about the environment, wildlife, and the people who are dedicating their lives to protect the world for future generations. These inspirational stories will take you from the Santa Cruz Mountains to remote areas of Africa.
Good day, everyone. This is Marcia Sivek, the host of BeProvided Conservation Radio. I hope this finds everyone and their loved ones safe in these crazy times. I have been very fortunate enough to be healthy and to have a healthy family, and I hope that's the case for you as well. I know there's a lot of news about COVID-19. There's a lot of anger toward China and the live wet markets. There's a lot of crazy finger pointing, blaming, and bad planning tactics from government and others that we should trust in such crazy times. But with all this, I do see the majority of us coming together globally, a positive light in the chaos. My guest today is Dr. Hayley Adams. She's a veterinarian who has a PhD in epidemiology and virology. She has many years of experience working with One Health in Africa, wildlife, and domestic animals. She is also an author of the book Conscious Conservation, which is a worthwhile read during these times, and any time for that matter. She is certified in meditation and compassion fatigue therapy. On top of all of this, she is a mother who is currently home schooling, and she is also a wife. And basically, she is much more than this, and she will give you a better summary of her background in this episode. Hayley and I were supposed to chat via Skype for this interview, but with shelter in place, homeschooling, and spouses working from home, finding time and quiet space is difficult where technology is advantageous to us in recording. So we opted to have Hayley answer questions from listeners and some from me in a pre-recorded session she could do when she could find quiet and time. So Hayley is both interviewer and interviewee in this episode, so thank you, Hayley. Our original goal was to discuss her book and her work in forensic wildlife studies and other topics not COVID-19. But during this time, I wanted Hayley to share her thoughts on this current pandemic and introduce my listeners to her. She has vast knowledge on emerging diseases from wildlife to humans. She also has a podcast called Conservation Without Borders, where she offers more scientific details to our current situation, and I believe it's 7 episodes, including this one, which is less detailed but very informative than her other episodes. Less scientific, I guess. You can find this series on drhayleyadams.com, and Hayley is spelled Hayley. So in this episode, Hayley touches on such topics that include how the coronavirus can affect our pets and should we worry. And note, this was a recording done before the tiger and other big cats were diagnosed with COVID-19 in the Bronx Zoo, so we didn't really touch on that topic. She also talks about how finger pointing and blaming may do more harm than good in resolving this pandemic and other pandemics. And will banning wet markets and trade of bushmeat from wildlife do any good? What can we do to help prevent the next disease when it emerges? Because, yes, it will, and we have to be prepared for it. She will talk about what is herd immunity, and is it good or is it bad? What can we do to help ourselves and others get through these times? What positive outcomes will come from all of this? Hayley also answers some listener questions, which touches on all of these topics. So I will stop talking now and let you get on to listening to Dr. Hayley Adams, who I'm very grateful for her cooperation and time in getting this important information out. So enjoy. Here's Hayley.
So today I'm doing a joint or hybrid podcast episode, and I'm going to be interviewing myself, but I was supposed to be interviewed by the host of the BeProvided Conservation Radio podcast, and her name is Marcia Sivek. And we, because of the pandemic it's been logistically difficult to come together, for me especially, to find both a suitable and quiet place to podcast that has reliable internet is challenging. And so we decided that rather than try and arrange a time where we could speak and record to one another, record live, that I would just answer questions that she submitted to me. Some are her own and some are from her listeners, and we're going to run through those. So as I said, I'll be acting as the interviewer and the interviewee. So yes, we are going to cover the pandemic. I'm going to try not to dive in so deep like we have on our previous episodes. So if you're interested in some of the deeper aspects of the pandemic, certainly you can refer back to the last 4 or 5 episodes. So probably episode 40, 41 or 42 on up through this current one. So I believe I said this was 47. But I'll answer questions. I'm going to cover a few different aspects, and we're not going to focus on, I think, the common knowledge that exists, because it seems these days that everyone's becoming armchair experts with the amount of information that's out there, which is a good thing. It's a great thing, but obviously it can be taken a little bit too far and cause people to get panicked or fearful or angry, and that's understandable, but we're going to take this in a conservation direction as we have been in previous episodes. All right, so if you listen to my podcast, this introduction will be something you already are familiar with, but for new listeners, I know Marcia wanted me to go over my background and a bit of my work experience just to give context to where I'm coming from. So a brief background is that I am a veterinarian by training, so I have a DVM, and then after a couple of years in practice, I did an internship in exotic and emergency medicine and worked in private practice for a while before returning back to get a PhD. In my PhD work, I focused on epidemiology and virology. So basically, I had been working with wildlife for years, even prior to going to vet school and prior to becoming a vet, and always had a desire to, specifically I had a calling to work in Africa. So I'd been going to Africa for a number of years, and the PhD, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to return to Africa to conduct my research and do my studies. So my PhD research, focused on a virus that circulated in lions. It's a lentivirus, which is a type of retrovirus. So it's similar as a virus to, for example, HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus. So we studied the virus in lions, and I looked at different aspects. I was in a unique position that allowed me to become specialized in both epidemiology and virology, because I was looking at virology or the aspects of the virus from a molecular standpoint. So I was taking samples and doing sequencing of the virus, but then so we also did some phylogeny of the virus, looking at how the virus circulates among populations of wild lions, and we were able to understand how the virus may mutate or change over time. And we also looked at things like co-infection, so how the virus may impact animals that have other chronic disease, and in lions in particular, we were concerned about tuberculosis. And then we also developed a specific test that had never before been developed. We developed a new diagnostic test to detect lentivirus in lions. So the work allowed me to develop a greater understanding of how disease impacts a population. And that's really what epidemiology is. It's looking at the bigger picture and looking at population level effects of both health and disease. So after I finished the PhD work, and I was working in South Africa, I was able to become double board certified. So I became board certified in 2 disciplines. One is called microbiology, and that contains the specialty of virology, and the other is in veterinary preventive medicine, which has several specialties, and one of those is epidemiology. So it also has to do with public health and infectious diseases and food safety and toxicology. So it's fairly broad. And so it's very applicable to what we're seeing today. You know, really my training, both as a veterinarian and then the specialty work that I did, it covers so much of what we're seeing unfold today that it's why I feel fairly compelled to speak out, because this is something that we as veterinarians, as veterinary scientists, we've understood the potential for this scenario for years, for decades. This is not new information to us. And so it's unfortunate in a way to see it play out, because we've had knowledge that certainly could have prevented it. But with that said, I think we have to look at this as an incredible opportunity for transformation on a global scale. And we have the knowledge and the expertise. We have people trained that can prevent these types of scenarios from occurring. But it's really only time will tell whether or not we can actually put the plans in place to make that happen. I know a lot of people are asking things like, is it too late and will this happen again? And yes, it likely will happen again, because we are, in a sense, we are broken as a global society, ecologically. And so in some ways it may be too late to prevent the next outbreak, but if we continue to learn and continue to work towards adopting more preventive approaches, then there is certainly hope that we can eventually prevent these types of scenarios from getting to the point that they have today. So, yeah, after becoming double board certified, I basically have worked in academia and the nonprofit world as it relates to conservation and One Health for the last 20 years. And so I teach graduate courses related to something we call conservation medicine. And again, this looks at all these aspects of disease outbreaks. We know they originate, a high percentage of disease we see in humans originates in animals, so they have animal reservoirs. And the One Health movement is something we, as veterinarians and veterinary scientists, we've used this term for probably about the last 15 years, I would say. It's become more common in our circles, but you're going to hear a lot more about it, I think, as global citizens today. And so One Health essentially is a way of looking at the interdependency and the interactions that take place between animals and humans. And so more specifically in One Health, we break that, into a triad where we look at the interdependence of human health and how it ties closely to that of both domestic animal health as well as wildlife health. And there's another very similar discipline known as eco-health that's taken, I think it's beginning to take on an important role in the last decade. And it's very similar to One Health, but it sort of extends itself a little further to include ecosystem health. So then the triad becomes the interplay between human health, animal health, and in that animal health, we're including both wild and domestic animals. And the third aspect of the triad is now ecosystem health. And so that's really important in looking at this COVID pandemic, for example, is that you have a breakdown in the system. And when you have a breakdown in the system, namely, you had an ecosystem barrier breach, so to speak, then you see the impacts on human health, and we will see it on animal health as well. We're not going to get into that so much today. Let me just touch upon it, and then I might come back and do another podcast. I know there's been some questions about whether or not our pets can become infected with coronavirus, this current SARS-2 pandemic, and more importantly, whether or not they have the potential to infect us. So the news is developing, and I'm following the infectious disease reports. I belong to some epidemiology and medical forums, so we're getting the reports from Hong Kong and from other, I believe the latest report, one came out of France and one came out of Norway. And so there are some case reports coming out about pets that have been infected. The reason that people are being very careful with their language in terms of the veterinary community and recommendations is that we don't want to cause panic and knee-jerk reactions that are unnecessary. So for now, I would just stress that it's not something to be concerned about. Yes, there's potential. And yes, it is likely that this coronavirus SARS-2 will have multiple mammal species that can become infected. But right now, the primary source of infection for humans, the primary source of transmission, is from other humans. So don't worry about pets for now. Use, your typical precautions. And another point that's important to understand, and again, if you have this sort of knowledge, it helps put your mind at ease. At least that's what I hope it would do. Animals are the source of, as I said, an overwhelming majority of human disease. It originated in animals. This is not something new. So again, it's not something to panic about. Your pets already have several potential pathogens that can be zoonotic. Again, the risk of transmission is typically low. That's why we don't talk about it, unless it's necessary. So your veterinarian is up to speed on these things. If you have concerns specifically about your own health, always talk to your veterinarian. But, in general, I would say try not to be overly concerned. The information we have is certainly developing, and we can go into that in more detail in a future podcast. So this pandemic is really massive in terms of its potential to change entire global systems, economically, logistically, certainly medically, socially, and psychologically. So it's really fascinating to see how this is unfolding in real time. It's important to keep in mind the virus itself is not necessarily the cause for disruption. It's really our lack of preparedness, of complete preparedness for such an event, and our inability to use preventive approaches to mitigate the spread in the early stages of disease. So now we're at the point that it really needs to just play itself out. So we can't stop the spread. And I also want to point out that flattening the curve, I think this has been a source of misunderstanding. But flattening the curve is not going to stop the overall cycle of disease transmission. So it will slow transmission, and that's very important right now because currently the goal is to prevent this overwhelming peak in intensive care needs or in hospitalizations that would overwhelm the medical system. So by flattening the curve, we're actually prolonging the transmission cycle globally. But that's a price we are willing to pay in order to prevent that overwhelming and potential collapse or temporary collapse of the medical or healthcare system. So also, we will all eventually become exposed. If you think about how many million, virus particles one individual can have and potentially be shedding, especially when they're asymptomatic, so they're not showing overt signs of infection, and they're essentially a carrier, so they're spreading disease unknowingly. You should just assume that at some point you're going to be exposed. It may not be immediately, but eventually you will be exposed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would develop what we call an infection, so where your body adopts an immune response to that exposure. And a lot of factors come into play that determines whether or not an individual will become infected and also whether or not they will develop clinical manifestation of disease. But assume that you'll be exposed. So we're going to have a high percentage of people infected, but many of those infections will be asymptomatic. And again, that can result in this carrier state. And a majority of infections will have mild to moderate illness, so will not need hospitalization. And then some will be in the severe category or the at-risk populations. And these numbers are changing all the time. So there's a massive amount of data being spit out every day, and it's changing every day. So it's really, sort of pointless if we continue to spit out the data because it's changing. You can use it for example purposes, but I'm going to steer away from that right now. So I think it's just important to remember, and I'm trying to do these things to reduce fear, knowing that it's an inevitability that you will be exposed because our bodies have no natural immunity. It's a new virus. It has to cycle through the population. But once it cycles through, then the important things will be to look at the actual case fatality rate, for example, and the short and long-term immunity that develops, because that is going to tell us how we can move forward living with this virus, because most likely it will continue to cycle through the population, as we see with other viruses like influenza viruses. So there's still a lot of questions to be answered. Keep in mind that the population of infected individuals is much greater than what's being reported. So the numbers that are being reported is based on who is being tested. And the people being tested are most likely those, because we have a dearth of supplies right now, the people being tested are those that are showing symptoms of disease. So it's skewing the results that we have to make it appear that this disease may be worse than it is. So those reports of fatalities, for example, might be inflated because we're not calculating the true prevalence of the disease as it's circulating. We can't do that right now. What we have to wait for is the development of serological testing, and this is what measures. So right now we're doing antigen testing, antigen-based testing. The antigen means the virus. So we're testing for the presence of the virus in subjects. Eventually, we want to shift, or as soon as possible, we want to shift to serological testing, and that's looking at the antibody response, the actual bodily response to infection. So if we can't detect the antigen because someone is asymptomatic and they're not going for testing, we need to test that asymptomatic population to look at evidence throughout the body of infection, and that's through the antibody response. So that's serological testing. Serological testing is going to give us a more true representation of how many people were infected asymptomatically. And if you're looking at, for example, calculating certain rates of case fatalities, morbidity and mortality in epidemiology, that's your denominator for certain rates. Not all rates, but this is beyond the discussion here. But likely what we'll find out is that there have been many, many thousands, if not millions, eventually, millions of people infected that just never showed disease. And so that's going to show us that the actual case fatality rate was not as severe as we thought. It doesn't mean that... Okay, let me make this point as well. I'm speaking right now as an epidemiologist. Our job is to look at population level impacts of health. We're not talking about saving individual lives. I'm not saying that isn't important. I think a lot of people also get frustrated and confused because we're relying right now heavily on epidemiologists to provide us information, which is important in making decisions on state and national and even international levels. And so these are different roles that people play. An epidemiologist's job is to provide information as it relates to a population's health. Okay, that's in opposition to a clinician's role, who is to make decisions based on an individual's level of care and health. So I'm not saying it's not important. It's very important to look at saving as many lives as we can. However, there is a balance that has to take place because, unfortunately, the reality we are facing is that not every life can be saved when we are dealing with the situation as it's unfolding in real time. So keep in mind there's a lot of decisions to be made, and we'll get into a little bit later how to kind of deal with your own emotional response to this pandemic, because we're also seeing that play out a lot. And, stress actually can impact your immune system in a negative way. So it's a very real possibility that the more emotionally reactive you become to the news that you're hearing and what's developing, you can put yourself in a more compromised position in terms of your health. So it is really important to do your best to stay calm and to let go of some of these emotional reactions towards how things are being done. Everyone's doing the best they can. They may not be doing the best that they should in your eyes, but everyone's doing the best they can. And that's where we are, and we have to accept that reality. So I just want to touch on the concept, speaking of epidemiology, the concept of herd immunity. I think, again, this has become a term that some people are getting frustrated with, or it's the cause of some frustration that I'm seeing here and there online. And I, again, just want to point out that herd immunity is, in and of itself, it's a good thing. Now, herd immunity is this concept that, again, as the virus is circulating throughout a population of individuals, there will be some percentage of these asymptomatic carriers. So they become infected, they develop an antibody response, which eventually shuts down the infection, and they no longer are infectious, meaning they can transmit the virus to new hosts or new uninfected humans. But this is a good thing, because the more people that can become infected and don't develop severe disease and then recover, they have immunity. So it's almost the same thing as being vaccinated, in that their body has cleared the virus for that time being. This is the question. We don't know how long the immunity is going to last, but it's usually safe to assume that even short-term immunity is going to provide us with up to a few months of protection. Again, we don't know. It could be a few years. It could be a few months, maybe 6 months, maybe 3 months, maybe a year. We don't know. But we're going to have a short-term immune response that's going to give us sort of a break, so we can, again, continue to catch up and catch our breaths and prepare for what is to come with this disease. So herd immunity is a good thing in and of itself, because the more people are exposed to the virus and become immune to it, they recover, they have immunity, that protects the uninfected population, because the chances of them encountering someone who is infectious reduces as herd immunity increases. So that's a good thing. Now, it's not to say that we rely exclusively on herd immunity and we don't do all we can to prevent the deaths and severe outcomes, but it does mean that eventually the population will begin to build up sufficient immunity to reduce the cycle of transmission and infection. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, again, about what sort of immunity we're going to have, and whether or not the virus will mutate over time to become more or less virulent, to have more severe disease effects. But for now, this herd immunity is going to be to our benefit. But again, we don't want to overwhelm the system, which is why we're trying to flatten that curve and sort of spread out this cycle of transmission. So it's a balancing act. One thing I found interesting, and there's so much literature right now being published and at such rapid speed, it's impossible to keep up with everything unless that became your full-time job. So I'm only hitting high points here and there. But one thing I did see is that they're looking at all options, and it really opens up the possibility for new ideas, which is great. I'm seeing a lot of collaboration between scientists and epidemiologists and some great ideas. I'm on a few forums with lots of epidemiologists, and we're always tossing ideas and discussing things. But they have looked at, and I think they're trialing this right now, they're looking at using convalescent serum in the interim between finding effective therapeutics that we can mass produce, such as vaccines. So this is a very old school way of treating patients, and it was used over 100 years ago. It's one of the first ways that we started to think about therapeutics. And it's where you take patients that have had viral illness and they've recovered, so they have that antibody response. You take serum from these patients and you're using that to inoculate either people at risk who haven't been exposed or they were recently exposed. So even if they have the disease, it might mitigate those more severe manifestations of the disease. So it's a means of potentially combating the severe illness. And this can be done readily. It doesn't take, a lot of special equipment or knowledge, and so it's a easily accessible means of potentially mitigating the impacts of this disease until we can put vaccines in place. So that, to me, is really exciting, that we don't always have to rely on new technology and expensive technology in order to help mitigate the pandemic. So a concerning aspect of this scenario, of this pandemic, is that from a conservation perspective, right now, there is a potential for transmission from humans to animals. It's called anthropozoonotic transmission, and this is a concern for certain endangered or threatened species, in particular, great ape populations. So mountain gorillas would be an example. They've had previous outbreaks of this sort, so transmission from gorillas which are endangered, and they have had close contact with humans, close enough to transmit respiratory diseases, including, for example, human metapneumovirus. And years ago, I was actually involved in some of the first research that helped to implement governmental policies for maintaining safe distance between tourist groups, for example, who are visiting chimps and gorillas in parts of Uganda and Rwanda. We looked at maintaining that social distancing for great apes even back then. This was over 20 years ago. And so this is just another example of how a human crisis can impact conservation. Gorillas also have, this would be a novel pathogen to their populations, and not just gorillas. I'm just using them as an example. But they have never been exposed to this virus before, and so now they have no immunity built up, and an outbreak in their population could have devastating impacts on the population. So lots to think about, lots to look into and take lessons from, so we can hopefully prevent this sort of thing from happening, either now or in the future. So let's get into some questions. The first question is about the origin of the current pandemic, and just wondering whether or not this could have been predicted or prevented. And I did go into detail about the origin of the pandemic in a previous episode. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was maybe 3 or 4 episodes back. So somewhere in the early 40s, the numbers of the podcast. And you can find the podcast on iTunes or most podcast players. You can find it on my website. It's drhayleyadams.com, HayleyAdams. And just click on conservation under the main tabs and then click down to podcast. So the origin was believed to be from bats, and it's a virus that they evolved with over millions of years. So I'm going to give kind of the Cliff Notes version here. So this is likely the cause or the case for the majority of infectious diseases that we see in humans. And that is to say, they evolved with a primary host in a specific ecosystem over millennia. And they don't tend to cause symptoms in their primary host. And we have seen outbreaks of what we call cross-species transmission, where a virus jumps from one species to another. And this is largely, and I would say primarily, the result of anthropogenic pressures or stressors. It's human-induced changes that have allowed these opportunities for cross-species transmission. The species is not to blame. Even the virus is not to blame. It's human behavior and human activity that is in opposition with maintaining ecological integrity that causes these types of events to occur and to get out of hand. So it crossed into humans likely from what we call a wet market, which is a live animal market in China. We know that the virus originated in China. So we know that it comes from a species of bat that also originated in China. Now in China, they're just like in many parts of the world. So we're not picking on a particular location. We're using this as an example that can be demonstrated in cultures throughout the world. There's a cultural preference for wild animals as a source of meat, and they also additionally prefer buying live animals. So it's not only consuming wild animals, but it's the manner in which they prefer to consume them, which is what they call fresh. So they want to bring animals together at these markets while the animals are alive, and then they purchase them and kill them and consume them fresh, so within a day or so, rather through more industrialized means. And so this cultural preference increases the risk for zoonotic disease transmission, that is to say, for disease transmission from animals to humans. And it became a pandemic when the virus gained the ability to be spread from human to human, when we see what we call sustained human-to-human transmission. And this sort of sustained spread over a large part of the globe classifies it as a pandemic. All right, so the virus is an RNA virus, and these types of viruses are known for having higher rates of mutation during replication. And some of these mutations, what that means, a lot of them, it's just the natural process of replication. When the virus is replicating, it makes mistakes. Some of those mistakes or mutations are nonsensical or dead end in the sense that they don't result in any sort of advantage for the virus. However, playing the odds, we know that some mutations do. They confer a certain level of fitness to the virus. So the virus is looking for increasing its own fitness and survival, just as all organisms are. And so some of these mutations allow these viruses to jump to a new species or to become more virulent, for example. And that means in terms of the type of illness they cause, it may become more severe in its clinical manifestation. Or it allows them to infect a new type of tissue, causing new symptoms to emerge. So, for example, a respiratory virus that normally inhabits the upper respiratory tract may mutate to be able to infect cell receptors in its host in a different part of the body, such as the lower respiratory tract. And that's what we're seeing with this, what we call SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome. It's a lower respiratory disease, and it tends to have more severe impacts in a certain percentage of the population. So again, you can refer back to the podcast series over the last few episodes that I've produced if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about this sort of thing. So the next question being, what are the risks of these live markets or wet markets to human health? Also, are live markets only in China, and what about bushmeat landing in the U.S.? So currently, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we are potentially facing, and again, why it's so very important to not play catch up with these disease outbreaks, not to take this reactive approach. This is a calling for us to transform our entire manner of the way we look at health and the way we act as a global society. What we are seeing globally is called a reactive approach. We need a preventive approach. Why? Because currently there are an estimated over 1 million viruses that we have yet to identify in wildlife species. It doesn't mean all these viruses are going to infect humans. It means there's a potential there. It's a massive potential for the spread of infectious disease and for new outbreaks of this sort. So we don't need to look at reacting. We need to get on top of this before the next outbreak occurs, before the next pandemic occurs. So there's there's areas we look at. We try and rather than worry about identifying every single pathogen that exists on the earth, we have to narrow down our areas of focus. And so what we do is look at areas that have what we call a high interface. And that is to say, high contact between humans and wildlife or domestic animals. They can also be reservoirs for disease, but we're talking about new, what we call emerging infectious diseases. These are new diseases to humans. We've for the most part gotten a handle on domestic animal diseases. So we're looking at areas of high interface and high potential for that sort of transmission. And wet markets are one of these areas. There's naturally a high interface because there's multiple wildlife species being brought into these markets, new animals and new species on a daily basis, and new humans. So lots of opportunities for transmission of disease. And these viruses, which inherently have errors when they replicate, which we can call mutations, again, it increases the risk that they may eventually develop a mutation that allows them to jump to humans or to have severe impacts and things like this. So other examples of high interface between humans and wildlife would be the bushmeat trade or deforestation. So anything that brings us into close contact on a sustained basis with wildlife increases that risk. And certain species may be considered more high risk than others, but we're just talking in general terms here. So yes, there is a risk at these live markets, and so we'll talk a little bit further about that in just a minute. How to prevent disease outbreaks of this nature in the future, or are we past the point of no return? Yes, so we have known about the potential for years, and I say we as a community of scientists who are experts in looking at the spread of disease from animals to humans, zoonotic disease transmission, as veterinary epidemiologists, as veterinary preventive medicine specialists, as veterinary scientists, as veterinarians, as ecological scientists. There's a whole gamut of specialists who have known about this potential and have been doing our best to spread awareness about this potential. But unfortunately, human behavior typically dictates that we are not going to care about something unless and until it impacts us on a personal level. And so what I would say to this pandemic, and we'll get into reasons for hope in a minute as well, but I want us to see this as an opportunity to learn the lesson that Mother Nature is screaming at us. And this might actually be the best way for us to transform, is only when our feet are put to the flames, only when our lives become so uncomfortable that the only thing we can do is change or continue to suffer, which is insanity, right? If we don't change, we will continue down this path of destruction. So how to prevent these outbreaks? Yes, we've known about this for a while. So we need to transform as a society our way of approaching health and disease and look at a more preventive approach, which is known as an upstream approach versus the reactive approach, which is typical Western medicine. It's what we are seeing play out today. We're scrambling to keep up with the disease. We're trying to mitigate, but it's too late. So prevention requires things like active surveillance in the hot spots or these areas with a high interface where the next emerging zoonosis or pandemic is likely. And the information is out there. So I'm saying this on very broad terms, but we have identified hotspots. We have identified, and there has been ongoing active surveillance for years. It's just more a matter of coordinating, of increasing the efforts, of increasing the funding, increasing surveillance of the reservoir species, as well as surveillance in domestic livestock and humans. Once it's detected in a new species, such as humans, active testing and tracing of all contacts and isolation of known infected individuals has been highly effective in slowing and stopping the cycle of transmission. That's been played out in South Korea. They've done a great job of tracing, and that has been really significant in terms of making a difference in the curve, so to speak. So there's certain actions that, yes, have been proven to be effective. It's just a matter of making that decision on a national, nation by nation. They have to make their own decisions based on the information they have. But we can reduce spread, but more importantly, we need to look at how to prevent it in the first place. And this goes into things like the importance of maintaining biodiversity, and in areas where biodiversity has been lost, looking at how we can restore balance to broken ecosystems. Ecosystem health is integral to human health. There are lots of examples, and I teach many examples in my course in conservation medicine about how specific breakdowns in ecosystem health leads to outbreaks of infectious disease in humans. Lyme disease is a great example of this, but there are many others. Hantaviruses, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, now the SARS, Ebola, all of these viruses happen to jump species, and we see spikes in infectious disease outbreaks in humans when there is some ecological break in the system. So going back to eco-health is important. Implementing proper hygiene and sanitation in areas where there is a risk. So we may not be able to eliminate all risk, because asking all humans or expecting that all humans will immediately stop doing all actions and behaviors and cultural preferences that increase the risk, that's impossible, right? We can certainly look at changing it, but it's going to take time, and most likely we're not going to ever completely eliminate risk. So we have to look at mitigating, reducing risk. And so we focus in on those areas where there is a high risk, and we look at how we can work with certain cultural practices to at least reduce the risk, and also monitor so that if there's an outbreak, we mitigate it before it gets to this point. Reporting and communication with all necessary stakeholders. So we're talking about the transdisciplinary approach, looking at collaboration between scientists and health professionals and political appointees. And you're seeing that happen. There are a lot of positives coming out of this pandemic. But these things could happen before it ever gets to this point. And hopefully in the future, that's what will happen. And then education. So attempts to minimize these behaviors by replacing them with culturally appropriate and ecologically sustainable alternatives. I talk a lot in my courses and on the podcast and in my book about steering away from this idea of what I call the can't do approach. Telling people that something they've done for generations and something they prefer, something that is habitual, something they are used to and they like, such as a preference for eating wild meat. If you tell them you can't do that anymore, it's not an effective way of stopping it. So we'll get into that in just a minute. So let's talk about lessons from the pandemic. Someone was asking about that. So I want to go through some areas that I think we will hopefully learn from and improve in the future. And one is that I think we will become very comfortable as a global society with this concept of One Health and eco-health, something we've been talking about for years in the scientific community and conservation and veterinary medicine and all of this. But hopefully it becomes an inherent understanding for all citizens that there's a deep connection between the health of the planet and the health of humans. And that is beneficial for conservation as well. So there actually could be some positives that come out of this, if we choose to take this as an opportunity to transform. Now, this is slightly off topic from the pandemic, but we can still use it as a general example. Someone asked, what can we do to pressure China to stop farming tigers and other exotics? And we could extend this to think about wet markets in general, these cultural preferences for utilizing wild animals in ways that are either inhumane, and or unsustainable. So first, I'd like to caution against the idea of the term pressuring as an effective means of implementing sustainable change, which is really what we want, right? So there's what happens when we pressure. It's this can't do approach. When we just tell someone, you must stop, we're banning this, you can no longer do this, there is a high likelihood of what we call resistance and reactance when we adopt these can-do methods. So reactance is, for example, it's an unpleasant reaction to someone imposing rules and regulations that threaten or eliminate specific behavioral freedoms. And so we see that it's almost a psychological rebellion that takes place between people or groups of people and a certain measure of authority placed upon them. And that's just human behavior. So we have to take that into account and recognize that just telling people what they can't do is not necessarily sustainable in the long run. So we have to instead use what I call the conscious approach. So I wrote a book a few years ago called Conscious Conservation, and this is really one of the tenets that I talk about, and it's going deeper beyond the surface level problem and understanding what I call the deeper whys. So we have this process that I teach in conscious conservation of asking the necessary why. Because the point is we want to continue to ask why. Why does this exist? Why is this a problem? Why do these people continue to do this? Until we get to what we call the root issue, the deepest level we can go. And often that is cultural, behavioral, or psychological in nature. And it's only then that we can apply sustainable ways that are culturally appropriate to replace the behaviors. Now, let me give an example in just a minute about how this has been done. But this can be done successfully in conservation on smaller scales. And it is possible to do it for wet markets. Now, it takes a transdisciplinary approach, and that is to say, working with a number of experts from different disciplines that come together and share information in a way that helps us approach the root of the challenge. Because, for example, as a conservationist or as a scientist, we may not think about cultural or behavioral preferences when we're doing our work. We tend to have more of a unilateral focus on the problem as we see it. And our perspective differs depending on our own experience in life. So it's important to understand from different disciplines what people's priorities are, what their behaviors are, and that helps us to really get, again, to the root of the heart of the challenge. So one example I want to provide in replacing behaviors that are seen as detrimental or destructive from a conservation standpoint, which we can also apply to a health standpoint. In parts of equatorial Africa, for example, bushmeat carries this cultural preference. So it's valued in local communities as a source of nutrition and protein, which is vital to their own health. And it's been, they've been consuming bushmeat for generations and generations. And so coming in as a conservationist or, as a legislator and telling them to stop practicing this without replacing it. So just taking away that source of cultural preference and nutrition and protein and not replacing it with something, that's unsustainable. So what it's going to do is you're going to cause rebellion and reactance, anger, frustration, and you're going to drive that market underground. They're going to continue to do it. You're just not going to know about it because it's going to become illegal and hidden. What happens is this actually increases the risk further that it will continue in an unregulated fashion. And this increases the risk of disease transmission and depletion of these populations because we can no longer manage it because it's hidden. So what some conservationists did, for example, in these parts of Africa where bushmeat is preferred, they took into account the need and they replaced it. So rather than just tell them, don't do this, you can't do this, they replaced it with a sustainable farmed species known as a cane rat. So it is a wildlife species, therefore you're maintaining that cultural preference, but they made it sustainable ecologically. And it was culturally acceptable. And so it empowered local communities to change their own ecologically destructive behaviors. And the entire challenge resolves itself. So rather than looking always at a top-down approach, a regulatory, a can't-do approach, we need to go deep to the root of the problem and look at how we can work with communities that are impacted and empower them to change their own behaviors. And then oftentimes the problem as we see it resolves itself. So I think that's a great example, and there's lots of examples in conservation of how this can be done. But taking it back to wet markets or tiger farming and things like this, we need to understand the motivations behind why they're doing it before we stop it. And we need to empower the actual people who are participating in these behaviors. We need to empower them to be the ones to change it. And whether that means we replace it somehow with something that is more humane and sustainable ecologically, or we educate them to a point where they might choose to stop it altogether. There's different ways you can approach it. But I just want to point out it's not always as easy as it sounds. It's not always just to mandate or ban that it be stopped, to ban it or to mandate that it be stopped, I should say. And these things take time, but there is certainly hope. And again, we're seeing it play out in real time. Hopefully we can learn these lessons. Then there was a question, again, this is sort of ancillary to the pandemic, but someone asked whether I think it's true that the Chinese are saying that injecting bear bile will cure COVID-19. So this has been all over social media. And what I want to say is I would assume that if it's being reported, it's likely true that it's being circulated as a potential therapeutic or cure. But I think whether or not it's effective, that's something I don't know. But I think the more important question to pose here is whether this is humane or sustainable to use bear bile, for example, as a potential therapeutic. And obviously, I would argue that it's not. So we're looking at the deeper issues. So looking at this conscious approach, it would be more prudent for us to try and understand why it's being used. So rather than have that knee-jerk response where we get angry and frustrated and we sort of paralyze ourselves to actually take effective action because we're focused on our emotional response, we need to become present and conscious and aware, which calms us down, and we look at why they're doing this, okay? And if we do this, we start to understand the importance historically and culturally of traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, in addressing disease and health in the culture. So telling them to stop doing it, if they are doing it, and bear bile, for example, is usually taken from farmed anesthetized bears. It's considered inhumane, the conditions they live in and the process of obtaining the bear bile. But it is used in traditional Chinese medicine. And so just because we don't like it doesn't mean it's going to go away if we tell them to stop. Just because we mandate they stop, and I say we, but legislation, if it's put in place to stop it or ban it, it could drive the practice underground, which actually is worse for the animals being impacted. It will probably mean that treatment is more inhumane because there's less regulatory control and oversight. And so we could be worsening the situation. So just an example, would be, if you're looking at combating the problem, is to work with the people. If you understand that TCM is extremely important culturally, then maybe we look at sustainable alternatives to this practice. So, for example, using herbs or plants that are already used in TCM that are not threatened or endangered. So replacing that preference for using one particular aspect of TCM with a practice that is both humane and sustainable ecologically. So it's, again, working with the people. All right, and we'll start to close up I just want to go through some positives from the pandemic. I think it's important to keep a positive or realistic mindset, at least. If you can't be fully positive, let's be present and aware. And certainly, this pandemic is bringing a heightened awareness on a global scale. it's impacting us all personally, and that causes us to pay attention. So I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to begin to discuss some of these important, deeper issues and look at how our global society is broken and how we can fix it. So there's a focus being placed on preventive medicine. This is a great opportunity for us to take this shift into more preventive approaches. It's a great opportunity as a veterinarian. I know we've talked about zoonotic disease and we have a lot of knowledge of diseases that impact humans, but for years we've sort of been overlooked or silenced by the larger human medical community. And I think we've been hoping to collaborate through the One Health paradigm with human health for years. And I think this is a great opportunity now for the work that we do to be taken more seriously, because this knowledge has been in existence. And, sometimes it feels like no one's listening because it has not felt important enough. And I think this is going to bring about potential funding and an opportunity for, so many new jobs. If you're interested in this type of work, in conservation and disease surveillance, this might really open up certain avenues for careers in these disciplines. So more of a focus placed on preventive medicine, certainly more gratitude for nature, both an appreciation for it because we're seeing the impact of what happens when we take it for granted, I should say. But also just being quarantined or isolated we've taken away so many modern day conveniences and modern day activities, mindless activities that we love to do. And we're sort of forced to contend with nature. We're forced to utilize nature now as a way of escaping the insanity that is the pandemic. So it's this irony that we're seeing where we've actually abused Mother Nature to an extent that, you could say this is a consequence of that. We're seeing this lashing out. And now is when we perhaps need Mother Nature the most. So it's a collective experience as well, which I think can be beneficial when we all feel something together. We all feel we're going through the same experience. It gives us an opportunity for greater compassion and empathy and connection. And again, that's the irony of this situation, is that during this quarantine and isolation, we're understanding the need for that collective human experience. Also, I think it's teaching us or demonstrating to us that we actually can live a much simpler life and be much happier. Everything is stopped. The world is sort of stopped for now. And I think we're understanding that we can get by with less, we can do less, and we can be present more. We've sort of stopped the hamster wheel. And a lot of people are reporting that they're almost enjoying this. They're finding a peace amidst the chaos of the pandemic. We're focusing on the present moment. There is global uncertainty about what is to come, and it's forcing us to stay in the present moment. At least that's the potential. Not everyone is, but that is the potential, is that knowing there is no guarantee in the future, there's so much uncertainty that all we have is the moment, is the now. And that is where healing can take place. That is where we find our peace. That's where we find our true connection with ourselves, with others, and with the global community. Also, I think the collective humor is on point right now. I've noticed through social media, videos or tweets or blogs or memes, that it's a measure of psychological resilience. And I have seen some of the funniest reactions to this situation. And it shows me that we're resilient as a society, as a global society. And humor can sometimes relieve some of that tension and bring us together. So I appreciate that. This pandemic brings to light our weaknesses. And through this bringing to light of global weaknesses, whether it's weaknesses in the healthcare system, in political systems, logistics, or even just human behavior and decision making. It's opportunities for transformation. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Sometimes it takes something like this to really wake us up and shore up our weaknesses. We are being forced to focus on inner happiness or joy and contentment in light of the chaos. So it's forcing us to go within and to dig deep, both individually and collectively. And I think it also teaches us how to accept present circumstances. And this is a general principle of mindfulness and meditation, and being conscious and taking that conscious approach, whether it's in your personal life or in conservation, as I teach about, is that we can only take positive action for transformation when we fully accept present circumstances. If we're still busy, frustrated, and wishing things to be different, hoping things would be different, angry and pointing fingers and blaming and shaming people that we want to, sort of put this upon as it's someone's fault, we're not accepting that this is what is. And acceptance, it doesn't indicate that we're giving up or that we are giving in. But that's where the true positive action can take place. It's when we come from a place of complete acceptance that this is how it is. Then we can begin to come up with solutions that can make a difference. As I said before, I think there'll be a much greater emphasis on preventive medicine and this eco-health approach and more surveillance in the hotspots. So these are all really positive things that are coming from the pandemic. So even amidst tragedy and crisis, we can find things to be grateful for and positives that can come out of these situations. Someone asked how we can manage personally with being so overwhelmed and obsessed with the crisis. And I think that ties into what I was just saying, these positives that come out of the pandemic. So from a personal standpoint, I've had a meditation practice for the past several years, and I've noticed my own subtle but very impactful changes in my life, both on and off the mat, so both in practice and outside of practice. So, meditation may seem difficult at first, but having a mindful practice, if you don't want to meditate, the experience of being present and not being consumed with your thoughts and listening to that stream of thoughts that can take you to places that are emotionally overwhelming, distancing yourself from the mind and the thoughts and understanding that you are not your thoughts, that your thoughts you can separate from, and that helps you to stay aware, and it can help to not be taken away on this crazy train where you work yourself up into all these scenarios of what ifs, into a future that we don't know about. So I think right now having a mindfulness practice can be very anchoring and comforting, and there's no more perfect time to experience the mindful approach than now, because the whole point of being mindful is understanding that all we ever have is the present moment. The future is not guaranteed. And so, yes, we should take action in preparing for what may be to come, but we shouldn't let it take us to a place, where we are emotionally unstable. That's not going to help us either in the present or a potential future moment. I think nature right now is a wonderful place to go in terms of helping us to stay mindful and present and aware. Nature is inherently present. Nature doesn't have the trappings of the mind that often paralyze humans with unpleasant emotions. So, nature doesn't have mindless thought activity. Wildlife is blessed with being aware, and sometimes when we're in the presence of nature, out in the forest or in the presence of wildlife, wild animals, wild beings, we find that momentary lapse of thought that allows us to experience the the contentment and the joy and the bliss of distancing ourselves from that mind stream of anxiety or depression and fear. So I think right now is a great time to experience nature and try to stay present. Try not to think so much about what's to come. Try not to worry and think about what we should have done, and be in this moment. Get out in nature, maybe find or cultivate a hobby that you have not had time to do when life was so busy, and spend time just sitting and admiring the sounds of nature around you. Maybe it's spring season where you live, maybe it's a changing of a season, and find beauty around you and help that to anchor you in the present moment and to have gratitude for what we do have right now. Let's see. And just to wrap it up, a question about what it means to be a conscious conservationist. So I touched upon this a little bit through the podcast, so I'll just say that I wrote a book a few years ago called Conscious Conservation, and really it was born out of my own experience in working in conservation for a couple of decades and personally experiencing a little bit of burnout and emotional overwhelm because of the state of the planet today, and what we see all around us is doom and gloom. And that's what we're sort of taught to preach as conservationists, was to be the town criers that were always telling everyone how bad everything was and focusing on the negative and mourning over the destruction and the loss of species. And that was very emotionally and intellectually depleting. And over time, I found I was becoming less effective in my work because I did not have because I was developing compassion fatigue. So through this process, I really had to do a lot of soul searching and figure out, I was always trying to come up with messages of hope, but inside I was feeling hopeless. And so I went through a bit of a life transformation, and out of this came this idea of conscious conservation. And I also became trained as a compassion fatigue therapist because we see it so much in our profession, both as veterinarians and I would argue in conservation as well. And a lot of it has to do with these principles of staying present and aware and shifting away from this focus on the negative and shifting away from having this us versus them mentality where we're always blaming what we perceive to be an enemy in conservation, whether that be poachers or politicians or big business. And we like to point fingers and put the blame on them. But by putting blame on another party, by having this divisiveness, we're actually taking away our own power and ability to enact sustainable change because we're giving them the power by blaming them. So it's really a way to transform our perception of how we see things, our mindset, how we approach conservation, and therefore to ultimately transform our way of doing conservation. It often, I'm trying to remove labels so that we begin to see humans as part of the equation. I think as a species, we've largely removed ourselves from the ecological equation, and I like to argue that we're very much still a part of the ecological equation, and we have to take that into account. So, we have to work with people rather than against people, take away this us versus them mentality. And I use practical examples through the book of how we can do that, and in the book, we work through the process of how do you go about changing your mindset and your perspective and thus your approach in conservation. So it's a pretty short and sweet read. It's an easy book to run through, but I think it can be very impactful if you really take time to absorb it and do the work, looking at how to, rather than only see problems in conservation all the doom and gloom that the media loves to report on, that we look at these rather than problems, but as opportunities for transformation. And really let nature be the blueprint. Let nature be the guide to show us where we can transform. And she's certainly doing that right now with this pandemic. It's a wake-up call. So, and then combating compassion fatigue, again, I would choose the media you listen to very carefully. I would steer away from sensationalist media. I would try to stick to what you believe to be as factual, and only take in the necessary information you need at that moment, whether it be to make a decision in your own life or, to keep up with what's going on, but don't become consumed with it. Step away when you need to, recharge, and, really cultivate an inner compassion for yourself. Be kind to yourself, be gentle on yourself, and, let go. It's also about letting go of a lot of things we worry about or are trying to keep up with. And just, relax. I think as a society, we really run ourselves into the ground, and we worry a lot, and worry and anxiety can be very unproductive and actually counterproductive to making positive change. So that's certainly enough for today. I know we've covered a lot, so probably what I'll do is break this into 2 episodes and just break it down into more digestible podcasts. But I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out and connect with you guys. Feel free to give me additional questions if there's certain points you want to cover, or questions that you have about the pandemic or anything that we've covered. Please reach out and let me know. And thank you for joining me. If you want to learn more about the book that I wrote, Conscious Conservation, you can also find that through Amazon, for example, but you can find it on my website, and that's drhayleyadams.com, and that's Hayley. So thank you so much, Marcia, for this opportunity to speak to your audience. I hope this was useful and interesting for everyone. And hopefully we can connect, Marcia, in a live chat someday. Maybe we can record another podcast together, as we were planning to do originally before this all got derailed and focused on the pandemic. But guys, check out Marcia's podcast. For my listeners, it's BeProvided Conservation Radio. And I'll have a link on my website with this podcast once it's released. So, thanks everybody. Have a great weekend and stay safe and stay healthy. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to BeProvided Conservation Radio. Links and resources to today's topic are in our show notes on iTunes. We appreciate your dedication and interest in protecting our natural world for future generations. If you like what you heard, please get involved by volunteering, donating, and sharing these podcasts with your friends. It also helps us to inform more people if you take a minute to leave a rating or review on iTunes. Have a great day, and thank you for listening to BeProvided Conservation Radio.